d'acier. Ils descendent par milliers, ceux qui vont sur cette terre lutter pour le vrai réveil. Il faut croire ce que l'on dit, ne lire que si l'on agit, être brave et être fier pour gagner son vrai réveil.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this very special broadcast of Brochu en direct, where I have the immense privilege of hosting Colonel Douglas Macgregor and Eric Dénécé on the show. This meeting was made possible thanks to the participation of French General de Dominique de la Warre, whom we would like to thank. It is also an honor for Quebec to serve as a bridge between France and the United States. France, which is linked to us through culture, and the United States, which is linked to us through geography. We thank our two geopolitical experts for accepting this invitation to share their analysis of the conflict in Ukraine with our audience. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to French Captain Pierre Place, who will be conducting this interview.
Yes, hi Carl, I greet your listeners, and to avoid wasting any time, I will immediately introduce Sir Denece.
Bonjour.
Here we go, Mr. Denece, hi. Thank you for accepting our invitation. It's an honor. We have been following your work for a while, and we are very happy to contribute today. Without waiting any longer for our audience, I'll ask you to very quickly introduce yourself because you have a rather large biography, and so I prefer let you choose by yourself the topics that you would like to expose concerning your background. Well, thank you for your invitation. Thanks to Mr. Brochu and also to General de la Warre. In a few words, I'm a former naval intelligence analyst. I served as a Navy officer at the end of the Cold War, and I was mainly in charge of Southeast Asia, where I've been committed alongside guerrillas, both in Cambodia and Burma. And after leaving the Navy, I specialized in economic intelligence, which means that we are actually involved in counterintelligence and information gathering. And then in the early 2000s, created the French Intelligence Research Center, who is now 23 years old and whose purpose is to explain in French-speaking world and especially to the French population the essential role of intelligence in a democracy and the running of the agencies, and then, of course, to analyze major international crises. All right, very well. So you are really among the most qualified French experts to precisely analyze the crisis that concerns all of us at the moment, which is the Ukrainian crisis. So, Mr. Denece, will...
Hi, sir. Very honored to welcome you today on RadioInfoCite. First of all, I will ask you to introduce yourself because our audience, which is mainly French-speaking, do not know you as well as we do.
I am a retired Army colonel. I served for 28 years, and I have a lot of experience inside NATO, where my last position was as the director of joint operations for the Balkans in 1998, 99, and 2000. And more recently, I served as the special advisor to the acting Secretary of Defense at the end of the Trump administration.
Donc, Monsieur Dénécé, donc on va parler tout de suite donc de la crise ukrainienne. Donc, en fait, ce qu'on voudrait avoir, c'est une sorte de point de situation. Donc, aujourd'hui, à votre avis, quelle est la situation militaire dans l'est de l'Ukraine?
In the summer of 2022, the Russian leadership decided that it would need larger and more capable forces than the ones that it currently had. And so the entire Russian defense establishment inside eastern Ukraine went over to the defense. That is an economy of force measure to consolidate control of those areas in eastern Ukraine that Russian forces had seized. Since then, the Russians have mobilized more than 300,000 additional reservists. They've had more than 80,000 volunteers, and the resulting force expansion has now reached to about 540,000 in and around Ukraine, with an additional 150,000 in support inside Western Russia and Belarus. However, despite the desire to launch an offensive much earlier, the winter did not freeze the ground in eastern Ukraine. And the Black Earth, which is perhaps 3 to 5 meters deep in most places, never was strong enough to hold up large maneuver forces. At the moment, it has become mud in the worst sense of the word, making significant offensive operations virtually impossible for both sides. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians have expended tens of thousands of soldiers in pointless attacks against the Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. And the Russians have, in response, first destroyed these counterattacks and then incrementally moved forward to seize key terrain in eastern Ukraine for the follow-on offensive. And we've seen that in Bakhmut and other areas along the 160-mile front. Bottom line is that right now the Ukrainians have taken horrific losses. They have a manpower shortage. They have an ammunition shortage. They cannot easily assimilate new equipment rapidly enough to make it effective in battle. So I imagine that we will continue to see incremental moves by the Russians, probably until May or June, when we will witness a massive offensive designed, hopefully from the Russian standpoint, to seize control of eastern Ukraine entirely and persuade the West and the Ukrainian government to negotiate.
Yes, of course. I agree with Colonel Macgregor's analysis. I would nevertheless add one point, because you have to know that if you are an analyst, as I am, you only deal with available information. And today, this Ukraine conflict finally gives us the opportunity to see a lot of information from both sides, and paradoxically, dozens of analysts to speak out while having only poor intelligence. Indeed, at this moment, it is clear that there is a slow down of the rhythm of the confrontation, not just because the Russians shifted, as Macgregor said, to a real logic of elimination and destruction of the Ukrainian army, but also because on the other side, Kiev tries to carry out offensives at all costs to maintain the support given by the West. So we are as much on a political logic as on a military one, and I think it is important to take it into account when we analyze the conflict. Beyond that, it must be said that we all spend a lot of time trying to sort the true information out of the false ones, with very anti-Russian speeches, trying to explain that the Russian army has not only failures from the beginning, but also some pro-Russian speeches, which would have us to believe that all this was a great series of victories. Today, and the result is rather in favor of Russia. I believe there is no possible dispute about that, even if some would pretend the opposite. And indeed, it would be essential to see in the next 3 or 4 months what decision will be made. Will this conflict finally be unlocked, or are we going to stay in a deadlock situation like today, which sooner or later will lead to negotiations?
Sir, from your point of view, what is Washington's goal in Ukraine?
I think Washington is somewhat confused on that point. Clearly, at the outset, they made a number of very strident and, in my judgment, ill-considered remarks, including the regime change argument made by President Biden when he was in Poland in March, as well as the complete withdrawal of Russian forces before any talks can resume that would bring this war to an end. This points to another deeper problem that I think your audience is probably aware of, but doesn't hear a great deal about. And that is that inside the United States, there is an enormous gap between the people in Washington who still remain intent on pursuing global military hegemony whenever possible. And right now, the target of that global military hegemony is Russia, with China standing just behind it. And the population that simply wants to be a market-oriented society, open to trade with all countries, and is absolutely disinterested in any sort of major war with any power on the globe at this point in time. And to this must be added our very severe economic crisis, financial difficulties, which are only growing worse with each passing day. So the government itself cannot retreat from a series of stupid policy remarks it remains wedded to impossible goals and objectives. And at the same time, internally, we are probably headed for a very severe economic downturn, as well as a divided society that is absolutely disinterested in war. It may be that the one thing that unites most Americans at this point is opposition to war.
Monsieur Denece.
Thank you, sir. Monsieur Dénécé, oui.
Yes, for me, I would say that the American goals are both blurry and evolving, and that today, or even since the escalation of the conflict, they depend on domestic concerns as much as on foreign policy issues. Besides, this is what the Russian side feels quite strongly when we try to negotiate with Moscow. So why are they confused? Because today in the United States, we have several power centers involved in politics which balance one another and even sometimes neutralize each other. On the one hand, there is, of course, the White House and its neoconservative circles with Victoria Nuland and with the National Security Advisor or Antony Blinken at the State Department, but also on the other hand, the Pentagon, and on a third level, the CIA. And that is a factor of instability in this conflict because on the Russian side, during the Cold War and the year which followed, they got used to have a single decision center in Washington. So today, this confusion creates a problem of interpretation and ultimately provokes a lot of uncertainties that tend to drive the Russians to be more and more suspicious about the decision taken by one or another leader in Washington. Then its goals are evolving. We should remember that after the intensification of the conflict, President Biden was very concerned about finance laws blocking, which the Congress imposed to him. He was constantly forced to negotiate budgets from quarter to quarter, and the exacerbation of a major crisis in Ukraine helped his policy, since everybody knows that when the United States are in a situation of war or nearly, the president can get budgets without any Congress approval. And then, of course, this situation of tension matched the wishes of the Pentagon, which absolutely needs to get spending commitments over several years to resupply its stocks of equipment. But as soon as this point was reached with the Russian intervention, which was obviously largely provoked, and given the partial failure of their strategy, the American goals changed, since they thought that Russia would collapse much easier. And now the United States have to cope with an existential war because the Russians, with the support of China and their other partners within the BRICS, are involved in a process of creating a second international monetary system. And this is a dreadful attack on the dollar hegemony and on the supremacy that the Americans are trying to impose to the globe.
Troisième question que nous souhaitions aborder. Est-ce que, de votre point de vue, la cause, entre guillemets, de la Russie vous paraît juste?
Yes, I think Russia's cause is very just. We have to go back and understand that from the very beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union, we made a series of promises to then Soviet leaders, Gorbachev and his successor, Yeltsin, that we would not advance the borders of NATO any further east. Obviously, that promise was simply discarded when the Clinton administration decided, for domestic political reasons, that it would be helpful to incorporate Poland and the Baltic states due to domestic lobbies. Again, the Russians objected, but they did not threaten, nor did they express any readiness to fight over it. They simply expressed their disappointment. Then in the 2008 Bucharest Declaration, we insisted, along with our NATO allies, that Russia recognize that ultimately Ukraine and Georgia would eventually become members of NATO. This, of course, was completely unacceptable to Russia, because that meant that it would now border NATO states that have, let us face it, a history and some hostility to Russia. And they were very concerned. In 2014, we supported a coup which installed a very hostile government, a government hostile to Moscow. This action made it impossible for the Russians to sit still, because they were convinced, and with considerable justification, I might add, that Crimea, which historically was never part of Ukraine, would suddenly become a naval base for the NATO allies and the United States. The last thing the Russians obviously wanted was to have a foreign naval base on the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. We insisted that their actions were illegal. We refused to listen to the Russian arguments. And I think the rest of it is history, except to understand that almost immediately we began building up a Ukrainian force with enormous quantities of money and equipment and advice. And at the same time, we encouraged the Ukrainian government to attack Luhansk and Donetsk, what we would call in the West two semi-autonomous republics in the East that were ostensibly Russian. Everyone spoke Russian. And of course, they doubled down on these anti-Russian policies, with the result that Russians living inside Ukraine, and almost a third of the population falls into that category, were being treated as essentially second or third class citizens in the courts of law, as well as people on a daily basis. We ignored all of these human rights violations. We ignored the Russian demands for anything. Then, of course, we get the Minsk Accords, which clearly President Putin and his colleagues thought was a serious attempt to come to terms with some of the issues that he'd raised. He turned out to be wrong, and we now know from Chancellor Angela Merkel that the Minsk Accords were simply an attempt to distract the Russians while we continue to build up this force in eastern Ukraine. By the time you get to 2020 and 2021, with this new President Zelensky, who was picked to run for office by Mr. Kolomoisky, the most powerful oligarch in Ukraine, he realized that we wanted a war. And we began to think in terms of conflict with Russia, but conflict that we thought we could manage, owing to the fact that Russia, in our estimation, was weak economically, weak socially, and weak militarily. We don't need to dwell too much longer on this, but we need to keep in mind that roughly 14,000 people were killed between 2014 and 2022 when the Russians finally intervened with a remarkably small force for the purpose, I think, of inducing us to negotiate as well as to signal the seriousness of their cause. So, yes, I think the Russians have a just cause, and instead of pouring buckets and filth and abuse all over them, we should listen to them. But we never have, and there doesn't appear to be any willingness at this point in Washington to listen to anything the Russians say.
Monsieur Dénécé?
Yes, I think it is important to remember that for 30 years, we didn't stop footing the Russians and their interest. So nobody here forgets how the Cold War ended and the fact that we Westerners, we have been able, with the help of the Americans, to fight against this totalitarianism and the expansion of the revolution and the proletarian dictatorship. That's one thing. But it is necessary to recall what happened since 1989, 1990, and 1991. At that time, the Russians voluntarily managed to dismantle their own empire, giving independence back to all Eastern republics, then letting the former Warsaw Pact countries join the European liberal sphere. And all this happened without any trouble. The Russians are the first to say it. Our nuclear weapons have been repatriated without the slightest leakage in the nature, and all our forces were withdrawn. It must be recalled that since the beginning of the 90s, the Russians widely opened their country, that FBI guys were in Moscow inside their police and militia, that American economists were on the spots there to restructure the Russian economy, that the whole bunch of American and Western military was also there to monitor the dismantling and the withdrawal of their nuclear weapons. So the Russians, whatever we say, played the game. They can't be blamed. And since then, we didn't stop looting their interest, and every promise that we have made was almost immediately broken. So there is a moment when somehow, like in 1918, when you behave that way, you literally create the conditions for future war. And to make a comparison, waving a red flag in front of a bull really caused him to stay in the paddock. And so this is what occurred through the events that arose at the end of the Cold War, of course, but especially since 2014. And I remember a conversation with a former KGB officer at the end of the Cold War, when the first contacts between the CIA, the KGB, and the French services were settled. He told me, beware, do not treat us like 1945 Germans. We were not defeated. The American tanks have not raided Moscow. The Soviet Union and its system collapsed, but Russia is here. And if you treat us as losers, well, you will endure a very hard blow in return. But unfortunately, our American friends maintain this attitude by treating the Russians as vanquished. And since 2014, we have done something that is much more serious, in my opinion. We have literally denied our values by supporting a putsch in Ukraine, whose president had been legally elected, even if Yanukovych was rotten, but who is not in Ukraine, and in any case, certainly not Zelensky or Kolomoisky. So we backed a regime change which overthrew a lawfully elected president with OSCE monitors sent there to check the voting process. And so all this has created the condition for the Russians to get into action, and somehow, this must be said, I think, the Russian intervention is justified. And of course, we could eventually make a parallel with what happened in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the real question that we have to self-address is, what would the American have done in a similar situation? That is, if a hostile regime had been settled in Mexico or Canada. I think we all know the answer.
And in your opinion, why are European leaders joining Washington in the proxy war against Russia?
This may be the most important question that we address in this hour. So I hope everyone will weigh in on this. We need to answer it. First, I want to remind all of your audience of something that General de Gaulle said, which I think is very true today as it was when he said it. And that is that Britain is an island and Americans live in France. And his point was that Europeans that live on continental Europe really need to tend to their own affairs. They have to assert themselves. And I think that unless leadership in Berlin and Paris and other European capitals assert themselves together, it will be very difficult to end this war before the entire Ukrainian state and nation are totally destroyed, because I see no evidence that Americans will do it. Now, why have other European leaders joined us? I think it's because of this destructive ideology of liberal internationalism, which we now call globalism. And it's the notion that whatever we do in the West, whatever happens in Washington and with our allies, is somehow or another morally justified, regardless of the circumstances. And that we have some sort of moral imperative that drives us to destroy Russia, which remains an independent state that rests on the foundation of Russian Orthodox Christianity and Russian ethnicity. Even though we know that Russia is very multinational and multicultural in essence, nevertheless, we regard it as being the last state which makes no apologies for its history, its origins, its culture, and its identity. I don't think most Europeans have any difficulty with that. I could be wrong, but I don't think they do. I know that most Americans do not. But just as we are under attack here in the United States from this administration for our own cultural identity, language, history, institutions, so too are many people in Europe. And I think if Europeans look at this through the particular lens that I've just outlined, they may question the validity of what we are trying to do in Ukraine. By the way, Ukrainians don't understand the war that they are being driven to fight, because they have been told to see Russia through the Soviet lens, and that's the wrong lens. Today's Russia has nothing in common with the Soviet state at all, or its society. And for that reason, more than anything else, everyone needs to step back and re-examine what we are doing. Again, unfortunately, that's going to have to be the lead that Europe takes, because I do not see any evidence for anyone doing that in Washington, D.C.
Yes, the reason why European leaders are following American policy is twofold. On one hand, it is a real victory for the United States, which were able to impose their vision in Europe since long through culture, cinema, and economy. And they can't be blamed for promoting their interests. Especially, they managed to persuade those leaders that their point of view was right through organizations such as Young Leaders and a lot of cultural influence operations. And then, on the other hand, it must also be said that our European leaders have become increasingly inept for the last 20 years. We are far from the generation of de Gaulle and Adenauer. The current leaders are deeply subjugated to American ideology, and I would say that basically we usually talk about the Europe of 27, but I believe that we should talk about the Europe of 28. The 20th European state is the Brussels technocracy, because above these states there is a level of individuals who are more and more stateless. That is to say, they consider themselves as European, as member of a club, and they no longer truly defend the interests of the nations they were supposed to represent. So it is more and more this stratum of the 20th virtual state, I should say, that is today guiding not only the policy of the European Union, but also the policy of the various states. And obviously, there were 3 states in this European Union that could do something. The British who exited, and here again, the British are more following their own strategy, totally oriented in the direction they wanted. And then we had France and Germany. France, for the last 20 years or so, at least since 2003, has hardly had a sovereign foreign policy worthy of the name, as we have seen recently with, for example, President Macron's adherence to the United States and European policies. And then there is a state that is even more disappointed. It is Germany. Germany, which plays a central role on the economic and political level in Europe, has been the victim of a real aggression from the East American ally with the destruction of the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines, and has literally capitulated. So today, it is extremely difficult to believe that there could be a European reaction given their alignment with the American position. I'm leaving aside the other small European states, such as Scandinavian or Benelux countries, which have long ago abdicated any sovereignty and, of course, rely on our American partners to carry out their defense and run their foreign policy.
Merci. Effectivement, c'était édifiant. Donc, dernière question. Sir, how do you think this war, is this war likely to end?
I think that the Russians have concluded that they have no one to negotiate with. And under those circumstances, they feel compelled to end this war with military power. The first phase will be effectively the consolidation of control over eastern Ukraine, all the way up to the Dnieper River and to the gates of Kiev. At that point, I think they will reconsider, look for negotiation partners, but failing any other negotiating partners coming forward, they will then cross the river and they will advance, if necessary, all the way to the Polish border. And this is because, from the Russian vantage point, there is no reason for them to believe very much of what we in Washington say. We've made promises before, we've said things before, we did not honor those promises, and we effectively lied. The Russians now know that they were lied to by both President Macron and Angela Merkel. And under the circumstances, they have no reason to believe them. So I don't see any other way for this to end, if from the vantage point of Moscow, than to complete the task of going all the way to the Polish border. Now, if I view it from a purely strategic perspective, obviously, I think we should be interested in securing neutrality for Ukraine and maintaining Ukraine as a very comfortable buffer in a reassuring sense for both sides, for both Russia as well as for NATO. But I hold the minority opinion. I have no idea what Europeans think at this point. But under the circumstances, that's what I see happening. Now, there is a danger, and I've spoken about this at some length, that people in Washington, together with some people in Warsaw and potentially others in London, may decide to launch a coalition of the willing, some force of some size, into Western Ukraine when it becomes clear that the Ukrainian government is going to collapse and the Russians are going to proceed west. I think that would be a terrible mistake. That could lead to all kinds of unanticipated consequences and dangers. I hope that doesn't happen, but I'm afraid that idea is still alive, even though we are absolutely not prepared for any sort of long conflict with Russia, or for that matter, with any other great power. But that is a real danger, and that would open up Pandora's box, so to say, to all sorts of terrible possibilities.
Monsieur Dénécé?
Oui, il est toujours difficile.
Yes, it is always hard to make prediction, especially in military matters. In any case, we can at least state a few things that, in my opinion, will not happen. The first is the Russians can't lose. Not only because they don't want to lose, as far as this war is existential for them, but above all because on the international level, their allies, especially China, cannot accept a Russian defeat today in the strategic confrontation they have against the United States. For the moment, the Chinese are very moderate and cautious about helping Moscow. But as soon as Moscow is threatened, which according to me will not happen, the Chinese will provide a strong support so that Russia doesn't lose this war. Secondly, it is completely stupid to think that Crimea and the Donbass republics could return to Ukraine in the future. First of all, because it has no legitimacy here. These are Russian-speaking areas which historically have always belonged to Russia. So here is the second issue. Either the crushing of the Ukrainian forces by the artillery goes on through a slow fight and the Russians could stay there just controlling the areas they have recovered, or indeed they could launch a larger offensive. For me, what seems important today on a strategic level, it is that finally both sides are half victorious. The American, on one hand, since they succeeded in totally enslaving the European Union, and although they didn't manage to achieve their goal, namely weakening Russia, it is therefore a victory for them. On the other hand, their strategy turned to be a failure when it comes to the dollar and the weakening of Moscow. On the other side, the Russians have managed to enforce, I would say, their policy by seizing part of Ukraine to show that they are decided to preserve their security. They also managed to gather around them China and the BRICS, but sadly, their image is severely damaged in the Western world. So in a certain way, it is also half a victory. And then comes the Europeans and the Ukrainian. So the Ukrainian are those who have lost everything, and this especially through the guilt of their leaders, starting with Zelensky. And then we, Europeans, are also, to a lesser degree, the fools of the game in this operation, since we had nothing to earn here and everything to lose. Thus, today, our economy is impacted. We'll have to totally restore our industrial activities, and even on the military level, we'll be more and more dependent on the Americans. So the situation report is extremely negative for European and Ukraine. By the way, I do not forget the innocent population of Ukraine who did not always support the Zelensky regime when it was involved in barbarian action in Donbass, and who have to suffer today from decision of their regime and are unfortunately under shelling. But beyond the compassion that we must have to this part of the people, I also do not forget that since 2014, a whole gang of extremists have constantly urged the offensives and the strikes against the civilian population in the Donbass. Thank you. So we welcome General de la Ward, whose help allowed us to invite both of you, Mr. Denece and Colonel Macgregor, and who might conclude, since he very well knows Colonel Macgregor. Now, General de la Ward has joined us, and we will try to conclude with Sir Denece and Colonel Macgregor. What I'd like to say after listening to this very brilliant show is that nearly everything was said, and well said, by both of your guests today. So I have nothing to add at the moment. I think that the essential has been told, and I can only support the two speakers for all that's said in a different but complementary way. Thus, it is good for the Americans to see that the French, in any case, some French, but not just everybody, are thinking like that. And for the French, on the other hand, to see that Colonel Macgregor, whom I've well known in the United States, who is not anybody either, and whom I'll tell you about a little later, has just given us a truly exceptional summary of the situation in only a few minutes.
May I add something? I wanted to say, I already said it during the preparation of the show, but it is very important for the American public to know, and for the French public too, to know that we have been accused because we tried to have an objective assessment of the situation. We have been accused to be pro-Russian and anti-American. Okay, personally, I'm a member of 5 associations of French-Russian friendship. It is true, but I am absolutely not anti-American. And as Karl Brochu said when he introduced the subject, we are linked to the United States by culture and geography. In fact, we have to remind that on the Battle of Yorktown, there were more French fighters than Americans. And I personally have family in the United States. I already said it. And I personally think that what Donald Trump called the deep state is the real enemy of the American population, which is suffering at the moment, exactly as the Russians were suffering from the Soviet dictatorship.
Yeah, I agree with what Pierre Place said. A large part of my family, sisters, nephew, and grandnephew are American citizens today. About 40 of them, 40 of them, and they are living in different states, Nevada, California, Utah, and so on. So what I would like to say to my American counterparts is that I have, of course, nothing against American people. And it's leadership of America which is now in cause for me, which is guilty for a lot of things, and not American people. American people are manipulated by medias like we are in Europe. Exactly.
Absolutely.
Just before I left SHAPE, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe in Mons, I had to give a short presentation to an audience. And at the time, they were talking about NATO, its purpose, its future. And I made the statement that if water is purest at its source, then Europe is the fountainhead of our civilization. And standing next to me was an officer with whom I became very good friends. He happened to be from the Foreign Legion. His name was Felipe Gonzalez. I've lost track of him. I'm sure he's probably retired from the Legion by now. But he leaned over to me and he said, "Douglas, the French do not believe that you are part of Western civilization." And of course, I was laughing and so was he. And I said, well, whether they know it or not, they are. And of course, I believe that. But I also believe that NATO was preserved after the collapse of the Soviet state for the purpose of preventing war in Europe. We have done the opposite now. We have actually provoked it. We provoked it in the Balkans twice, first in Bosnia-Herzegovina and then subsequently in Kosovo. We have carried forward this approach in Ukraine. It needs to stop. It will only stop if our European colleagues stand up and demand that it stop. We can't do it here, at least not for another year and a half till we have new elections.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
See you.
Au revoir.
Au revoir. Merci.
Very honored and very pleased to have you here.
Thank you for listening to our radio broadcast on the world events We hope you enjoy our selection of topic and our analysis. If you have any comments about it, write to us at the following email address, studio@RadioInfoCite.com. We will be delighted to receive your opinions, suggestions, and questions. Your participation helps us to improve the quality of our broadcasts and meet your expectations. See you soon on RadioInfoCite.com, the radio that inform and entertainment you.